Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Iliana Bobova and I'm Chief Editor at Advent Group, the honored organizer of the Merit Summit taking place in Lisbon in January 2018. The goal of the Merit Summit is to facilitate and intensify the connection between higher education and the corporate world, because cooperation between business and academia creates remarkable added value and growth. Today, we would like to inspire a discussion that will continue in January on a broader scale, face-to-face, during the Merit Summit, where corporate and higher education leaders will meet for a second consecutive year. The webinar presentation today will take about 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A session for another 15 minutes. Now, I would like to give the floor to Professor Nadim Habib from Nova School of Business and Economics, our diamond partner for the Merit Summit in Lisbon. Professor Habib will talk about how we can transform the corporate learning so that it fits today's agility. Professor Habib.
Thank you very much, Ileana. And welcome to everybody. Over the past 10 years, I've been traveling around Europe and North America and Africa as well. And I've been meeting with organizations, and I've seen a very, very interesting trend, which is interesting from an academic perspective, but for many of them, much more stressful than I thought it would be. And one of them is what I call the growth challenge. Organizations are finding it much more difficult to generate top-line growth, market growth, revenue growth. And because of that, there's a certain sense of anxiety in the system. Now, if this wasn't enough, what's really interesting simultaneously is that most executives and most people on their teams are reporting dramatic increase in workloads associated to this flat growth. And that is this big contradiction that I find that's become fascinating, is what is happening so that organizations are finding it difficult to grow, yet at the same time, people within these organizations are finding workloads increasing. They're finding number of emails increasing, number of meetings dramatically increasing, and anxiety and stress dramatically increasing. We're talking working after hours, at home, on the way to work, et cetera, during the holidays, et cetera. And all this in an environment where growth is ever more difficult to achieve. And so to a great extent, a lot of my initial research was looking into what is happening and what is driving this. And what was interesting is that when I did start talking to people, what I realized is that many thought that their biggest challenge was the challenge of organization, the challenge of planning. The notion was, we're not planning well enough. Actually, interestingly as well, many times the notion was that this was an individual problem and not so much an organizational problem. I need to get better organized. I need to plan better. I need to take a time management course. I need to buy colored Post-its and put them in a special diary, et cetera, et cetera. But from my initial research, what I discovered was that it is not an individual problem, it is definitely an organizational problem. What we tended to see was that most of us are trying to plan. The more idealistic among us sit there on Sunday night and they say, on Monday I'm going to do this, Tuesday morning I'm going to do this, Wednesday afternoon I'm going to do this, et cetera, et cetera. But what tended to happen is that most of these people would come in on a Monday and suddenly they'd get an email they didn't expect, they'd be called to a meeting they weren't expecting, they'd have to write a report they weren't expecting, they had a phone call they weren't expecting, and these surprises would happen continuously throughout the week, and suddenly it was Friday again, and they achieved nothing of what they had planned. And these surprises is what's ruining most people's attempt to take control over their lives. Now, when we dig a bit deeper into these surprises, in effect, what's happening is, this is what I call the world is changing. Imagine that we all line up linear processes, the way we do things, the way we like to do things. And what tends to happen is when the world changes, these processes generate an exception, and this exception creates a surprise for somebody who then puts in motion a domino effect throughout the organization dealing with this surprise. And this is what change is doing to our organization. And I think we all accept that the world is changing. I don't think I've been to any conference where a speaker has not started their presentation with the world is changing. But I think sometimes we don't dig deep enough into the anatomy of change. What is this change we're talking about, and what's so special about it? And I think it has to do with a lot with management. Now I'm 50 years old, and most people in my generation learned how to manage in a world that was radically different from today. If we think about it, most of us learned how to manage in a way, in a world that was different in multiple dimensions. First of all, I think most of us learned how to manage, if we look at the 50s and 60s, in a world where level of education in our society was much lower. When we look at the history of management, and to me, really the turning point is 1911, when Frederick Taylor publishes the Principles of Scientific Management, that really changed the world. What we have to understand is that in 1911, the history of management, the birth of management, of modern management to a great extent, the world was radically different in one simple way. The majority of people in the US at the time were not as educated as they were today. Actually, close to 95% of the population did not have primary education, could not read and write. Now, if we think about it, when you design an organization in a country or in a market where most of your employees are literally ignorant, how do you see it? Well, you tend to see management as very linear, very causal, very top-down, command and control, and therefore management is all about the person who leads is the person with most knowledge. They design linear processes. As long as everybody obeys these processes, we should be able to deliver. And I think for many, many years, we see these traits of management still going through our organizations. Very top-down, the role of the manager to command and control, to be the visionary, to make sure everybody follows the instructions. And to a great extent, we rewarded employees that were obedient, because obedience was really the key to allowing the manager to put the master plan into effect. And I think for many, many years, most of us who grew up understood this implicitly. We were joining organizations in the 70s and 80s, and we were very careful about the way we were introduced to the organization because management processes were linear and that was how it's going to be. Now, the world started to change very radically. In the US, for example, in the 60s, in Europe slightly later, and we can see this through what education. We started educating our people. In the US, if you look at higher education enrollment, you'll notice in 1960 it goes exponential. It grows like this. Interestingly enough, in 1981, women overtake men at universities in the US, leading to the natural conclusion that since 1981 till today, we have more qualified women than men in the US market. And we still note that in our organization, this has not been reflected as much as it should be. But more interestingly, in 1960, we noticed this explosion in higher education. In Europe, you see this happening in the 70s. In the south of Europe, you see this in the 90s. And what's really interesting is when you go past the 20 to 25% tipping point of the population that goes to university, you start seeing a change in society. Many of us will have heard of the 60s, students in the street protesting, et cetera, et cetera. To a great extent, this was a new segment of the population that was saying, I'm educated, I'm qualified, I have access to information, and therefore I will not follow orders as I used to. I want to participate in decision making. And we saw them join multinationals in the 70s and 80s, and in most countries that we see, multinationals during the 80s and 90s had more progressive management techniques and policies than local companies, many times because of this. Now, why is this relevant? Well, to a great extent, because as you go from an undereducated to an educated workforce, something starts to change in society. And the most important thing that changes is their ability to assimilate innovation and science and implement it. And so what you suddenly have is, not only do you have more educated people, but you have more educated people who with new technology have access to knowledge and they implement it much quicker. And therefore we have the second effect that we start to feel from the 80s and 90s onward, which is an acceleration of change. So what tends to happen is, because more qualified people are operating in the world, new technology is assimilated much, much quicker. Because of that, it is implemented much, much quicker. Therefore, change starts to accelerate. And I think anybody who's seen a lot of the work done at Singularity that shows that electricity took 46 years to reach 25% market share, while the internet took 7 years to reach the same 25% market share, understands implicitly that change has been accelerating, moving much quicker. Now, this puts in question one of the central tenets of management that Taylor defined, which is the concept of efficiency. Efficiency is a great concept. It's minimizing error, it's minimizing cost, it's optimizing structures. But efficiency depends on one essential ingredient, which is the ability to predict the future. Now, if we think of 1911, technology was assimilated very slowly, information flowed very slowly, so there was very little change in the world. It was relatively simple to predict next year. And why do I say this? Let's think about a restaurant. If a restaurant knows how many people are going to show up for lunch tomorrow, they can optimize their purchase of raw materials. If they know at what time everybody's going to show up, they can optimize the number of tables they have. And if they know exactly what everybody will be eating at every time, they can optimize the number of cooks they have in their restaurant. Efficiency depends on predicting how many people are coming. If they don't know how many people are coming, it's very, very difficult to be efficient. You've got to take a guess and then hope that you got it right. Or what we see now is happening in management, you've got to be agile, which means you have to be able to do your second best based on what actually happens on the day and be very quick at moving through. And so what we're seeing is that two central tenets of management, command and control, and together with that, efficiency, are now being challenged simply by the fact that we have much more talent around us in the market, talent as our employees, and talent as our customers. I think it's ironic or interesting that the Nobel Prize in Economics went to a behavioral economist. Why? Because what behavioral economists are telling us is the more qualified our customer base are, the less rational they tend to be in their decision making. Qualified people tend to be more emotional in their decision making, and that creates even more turbulence from a customer side. So we now have organizations that are working with a lot of talent in an accelerating change environment where customers are changing their mind at faster and faster paces. And so it's natural that what we start to hear continuously throughout the world of management is the word agile. Agile means faster, adapting faster, moving faster, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we break agile down, what it actually means is, in my definition, is being able to make decisions quicker. And if we think about it, the quicker an organization can make good decisions, the better it can adjust to change. And if it can do it quicker than its competitors, it'll be a step ahead of the competitors and therefore will take advantage of it. If it's too slow, it might die. That's as simple as that. And so agility is about making the right decisions as quickly as possible. And the great tendency is to see it as happening lower down the organization because that's closer to where the market's shifting. So the more we can push the decision making down the organization, the faster we are and the better we can react to change. Most organizations understood this, and we saw a move in the 90s to change their structures to deal with that. We saw organizations started delayering, so we became flatter, and the notion was clear. If I have less layers of hierarchy, then what can happen is information flows quicker and decision-making will be faster. We also saw people working towards matrix-style structures where I'm a part of one team, but I'm also on other projects, and I'm on 4 or 5 other teams on different projects during the year. And the idea here as well also is that if I get people to work across their silos and departments, information will flow quicker and we have better decisions. But we forgot one thing. Both of those two structural changes would not work unless we had behavioral changes to go with them. Because think about it. If you're a command and control leader and you now have more direct reports than you used to because we have delayered, what now happens is if you want to keep controlling people, instead of controlling 3, you're now controlling 13, which means you now have a queue of people waiting to see you in the office for you to make decisions. What you have to understand is that the shift that's happened in leadership is from a scope of control to a scope of influence, and that requires behavioral change. On the matrix side, on the multiple project side, I think we've all sat in on conference calls where we just let people talk while we do our work. Why? Because still in many organizations, we feel that people can only belong to one team. And therefore, when they get sent off on another team for a project, they get told that they're being out there representing their original team. And therefore, their new teams become kind of like a United Nations where they go there to make sure their original team doesn't lose resources or power within the structure. So collaboration suddenly becomes key. If we do not teach people how to collaborate, if we do not teach leaders how to change behavior, these new structure, instead of speeding up decision-making, will actually slow us down. And let's face it, this is what I'm feeling in most organizations across Europe, is that people are feeling that it's getting more and more difficult to get decisions taken clearly and fast. Organizations slowing down, becoming more bureaucratic, becoming more cumbersome in a world that's accelerating change. And so it's no surprise that most people who are working today are feeling heightened levels of anxiety and excess number of meetings, because think about it. An anxious manager will book more meetings with their teams simply because it gives them a sense of control. Teams that spend more time in meetings get more frustrated about everything they else have to do and therefore get insecure. Insecure managers and insecure teams mean that they need more meetings before decisions can be made and everything slows down And this is the disease we're seeing spreading through a lot of organizations. And of course, it is this environment with flat growth that is generating a lot of the questions within companies. How can we become more agile? And I think the clue really is in what I've been saying. It involves changing the way we lead. It involves encouraging better cooperation. And though it's all very nice to say, let's all go do a team building workshop, the reality is that if you have a lot of talent in your structure, cooperation happens for slightly different reasons. And the first one is what I like to call purpose, clear purpose. If there's some things that can change, some things cannot change. And that for me is the purpose of the organization. Some people call it a vision, some people call it purpose, some people call it a mission. It kind of depends what language, what organization language you use. But an example I like to give is Nokia. So Nokia for my generation was Apple. You know, we all had to have Nokia phones. They were the best phones in the market, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about it, Nokia had a very, very clear purpose to the extent that their purpose was stuck underneath their logo. That's how powerful it was, connecting people. It made sense that if you worked at Nokia, you would come into work every day and you'd ask yourself a question: are we still connecting people? And in my opinion, what tends to happen is that this purpose was there and then it got forgotten. As people were optimizing supply chains for phones made in China and different stores and how many models and how many colors, et cetera, the world changed. And what changed was that, and I remember the day I was working and suddenly I got email. And as soon as I got email, I added a new dimension to the way I was connecting with people. And Nokia wasn't giving me that. And that's when BlackBerry showed up. And with BlackBerry, I could phone, SMS, and now I had email as a new dimension. And essentially, BlackBerry started connecting people more than Nokia. And then the world shifted again. And what we saw was that we needed to connect through social, through images, through music, through social media, et cetera, et cetera. And now Apple today is doing it. And let's be honest, if I stick an Apple iPhone X or iPhone 10 ad in front of a group of 10-year-olds and I say, Apple, connecting people, I think they'd all nod their head and say, yeah, that makes sense. I think the lesson here is that purpose is not something nice we produce because we have to put it on our website. It's not about saving the planet. It's about understanding that in a world of constant change, our people need a framework within which to innovate, within which to get ideas. Nothing frustrates me more than people calling people into a room and say, let's all brainstorm. There's nothing as a bad idea. And then they use a terminology which annoyed me even more, which is, let's think out of the box. I want an idea out of the box, as if there's a box in the room full of ideas and we want one that's not in the box. No, we want ideas within the box. And that box is the framework. And what is that framework? It's our purpose. And the basic premise is, are we still connecting people? If not, what should we do to connect people better? How can we connect people faster? How can we connect people in a different way? And I have a feeling if Nokia had had that relentless focus on their purpose, they could have deployed their talent much better and become much more agile. And they could have responded to changes in technology and behavior while keeping one thing permanent, which was their purpose. The second thing we really see a lot today is strategy. Now, 50, 60 years ago, strategy was something top management would look at, and the rest of us kind of accepted that they were thinking about the big things. We didn't need to worry about it. But what we're seeing in organizations that are agile today is that strategy is being pushed down the organization much more. We have talent underneath us that says, I understand the framework, that's my purpose, but I want to know what the plan is. What are the strengths we need to work on to deploy against our greatest opportunities? And where can I focus my energy? That's strategy. When we tell people, please focus, we have to understand that we also need to give them our strategy so they can understand where we need to focus. Focus is about focusing on our strengths to deploy against our greatest obstacles or opportunities, and that is strategy. And so organizations have to not only define a very clear purpose and ensure that it's continuously pushed through the organization, but they need to develop a much clearer strategic dialogue that helps people focus on what is important. And if they do those two things, they will start to see their talent becoming much more proactive, much more responsive to the market, but also understanding that certain things don't change, as, for example, the promises we make our shareholders, the promises we make each other as colleagues, and the way we operate together. And those two become fundamental in the way organizations build an infrastructure that allows people to be flexible within something that's fixed. And all this means that we need to change the way we lead. And I think the biggest shift and the most difficult behavioral shift we're looking for is the way we train our leaders and the way we develop our leaders. When I was a young manager, for me, leaders knew more than everybody else. We went to our leaders to seek answers and approval for our ideas because they were leaders because they knew more than us. But in a world of rapid change, this gets more and more complicated. I can't imagine a manager at my age understanding what a social media strategy is, for the simple reason that I don't have social media. And so I wouldn't even know how that works. My kids seem to think that I don't have Facebook because I don't have friends. But the reality is I wouldn't know what to do with Facebook. Now, leaders who grew up understanding that the world has shifted are the ones who are making the biggest impact. It's got a lot to do with the fact that I, as a leader today, I'm not here to give answers. I am here today to do something else. When I ask people, what is a great day at work? So what is the day when you left work exhausted but euphoric? You had a great day. You had a great day. People in my generation will say things such as, oh, I managed to complete all my tasks, which kind of is indicative of the lack of ambition we have in our job. But younger people are saying, it's a day when I learned something. It's a day when I overcame an obstacle and grew as a consequence. And it's a day when somebody recognized what I've done and thanked me for it. If you think about it, those are three very cheap ways to motivate people. Yet, we don't seem to have an easy time doing it. How many leaders today understand that their role is to create learning moments for their people? And this could be learning moments that are as simple as come to a meeting with me and see what it's like. Or why don't you do a presentation for the board because it's your turn to go out there and show what you know. Or why don't you go to a client on your own and deal with that on your own? Or why don't you take 3 days off and volunteer at a client's organization to understand how they work? How many leaders are doing this? Not enough. The second issue is how many of us are teaching people how to grow? And that means something very interesting, which is we have to shift our mindset from giving people answers to learning how to ask people the right questions. When people come to us with a challenge, traditional leadership is, you should do this. This is what you should do. Oh, you got that problem? Do that, do that, do that. What we're seeing today is great leaders don't do that anymore. They ask questions that allow people to solve their own problems, therefore overcoming their own hurdles, and therefore growing as individuals with the pride of the fact that not only do they solve a problem alone, but they learn through it. And ironically, by creating learning moments and allowing people to solve their own hurdles, we allow people to become more autonomous, which liberates leadership to do their job, which is to hammer away at purpose and strategy to allow the organization to deliver. And then finally, how many of us spend enough time recognizing the effort that people are doing on our teams? Most middle and lower managers indicate that many of their bosses do not have a clear notion of the effort it takes to complete certain tasks that they've been asked to complete. And therefore, the effort and volume of work they have is not being recognized above. So this new shift in leadership, together with clear strategy, together with purpose, interestingly enough, will start shifting the way organizations act. And they start becoming much faster and much more agile. Because what tends to happen is decision-making is pushed down the structure, and it liberates top management to focus on what their real job is, which is to look into the future and to start building organizations that can deal with the future. And finally, it allows innovations to start to happen. And again, innovation in most mature organizations is not about disruptive. It's more of an evolutionary process where we understand that we permanently, in a changing world, we are permanently imperfect in the way we serve our customers, but new technology and new changes can give us new opportunities to do better. Let's look at taxis, just basic taxis. In most countries before Uber, you used to have to make phone calls to call for a cab, and you wouldn't know where they were. And so you'd stand in the street many times in the rain, wondering if they're going to show up or not, and worried about whether you're going to make it to the airport or not. Then when they finally showed up, in most countries before Uber, you'd have to pay with cash. And so if you didn't have cash, they'd have to stop at a bank machine for you to get money out, et cetera, et cetera. And if you wanted a receipt, they'd have to fill out a form, and it was always very complicated. What we're seeing is that in most countries, when Uber came along, customers jumped to it simply because I know where they are, I don't need cash, and if I want a receipt, I'll just download it later. Was this disruptive? Not really. What happened is that the cab associations in most countries didn't understand that they were, one, underserving their clients, that things were imperfect. And I'm sure if they had asked all cab drivers to contribute with where they were failing, they would have seen this. Second, they didn't understand how technology was shifting, how satellites were allowing GPS prices to drop so much, how mobile telephony was changing to allow GPS to be on your phone and therefore allows me to identify where people are, how mobile payments were coming about to allow people to make payments, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, they didn't see how new technology could help them solve those problems. And because they didn't, somebody else did. And that's the essence of innovation. As an established firm in a certain market, you have an obligation to be the first to innovate because you feel customer pain point much earlier than everybody else. It is because you're not agile enough that your people on the bottom cannot send information up quickly enough that you tend to miss the target. And so innovation becomes much more possible in organizations that are agile because they push decision-making down, because top management focus on purpose and strategy, allowing their people to grow into positions of autonomy and deliver better results. Now, this means that when we look at the learning function within organizations, we have to rethink a lot of what we've been doing. If we think about, so they would take young, train them as they went up, different skill sets, many times technical, then more general, more leadership. Many organizational learning structures would divide themselves into general management stuff, leadership stuff, OB stuff, soft skill stuff, hard skill stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of trying to understand what it is they're trying to build. And I think for that, there's a big shift we need to understand from the Tayloristic view of management to what we're seeing today, to a more entrepreneurial view of management. So a Tayloristic view of management believed that the role of senior management was to predict the future so that they could then allocate the resources to deliver results in that future. What we're seeing in more entrepreneurial cultures is, if I can build an organization that can deal with any future, then I don't need to predict it. And that's a big shift in thinking. It's a much more internal focused learning function that is all about building an organization that has the talent to deal with any future that comes, no matter what it may be. It is one that spends a lot of time allowing people to get a deeper understanding of the purpose of their organization, with case studies, with ideas, with examples, with Q&As with senior executives, with town halls, hammering away at the purpose of the organization. Because if that is clear through learning, then it gives everybody the framework to operate. The second thing is learning function has to start thinking about is how are we disseminating strategy. First, how are we teaching people what strategy is at all levels of the organization? Because in the end, strategy is about where are we going to focus our energies, what are the biggest opportunities or obstacles, and how are we going to focus our energies to take advantage of the opportunities or overcome the obstacles. And so strategy has to be the language of everybody. It is what gives us all focus. It is what allows us all to contribute to the common plan. Learning organizations not only have to teach people what our strategy is, but also what strategy is generically and what good strategies look like compared to bad strategies. And once those two are done, a whole effort needs to be made in changing the leadership function. Leaders have to see their role as producing the next generation of leaders, to a great extent as unlocking this talent that exists within the organization that can add 10, 15, 20 to 30% to productivity gains and top line growth if they are given the right combination of purpose, strategy, questions, coaching, recognition, etc., etc. And this means that leadership needs to be rethought as a top-down, continuous change process as our society changes and as the way our talent and recruitment changes, so that we ensure that we continuously have leaders who are able to have the right conversations with the right people at the right time, what I call meaningful conversations. And once we have all those three together, we realize something that's very, very interesting, which is, in a world that's permanently changing, I feel that the learning function needs to be the one thing that doesn't. It needs to continuously do the same thing, which is give people things that don't change. This is our purpose. This is how we develop strategy. And this is how we encourage people to grow. And if we do that, then we succeed in giving stability to a structure that desperately needs it. Because when we look at it, what's really interesting is in all this world of very much change, there are two stakeholder groups that most organizations seem to want to promise no change to. One is shareholders, and the other one is customers. These are both stakeholder groups where we say to shareholders, we will promise you X results next year, and if we don't deliver this, we will deliver more than this. And that's why it's always such a disappointment when we miss our targets. We give guidance of what we're going to deliver to them next year. We give our shareholders more predictability than we give our employees. And then we turn to our customers and we say to them, we will give you so much predictability that you can change your mind, you can do anything you want whenever you want it. Now, if you think of an organization like a string from top to bottom, where the top is fixed and the bottom is fixed, then guess what? The only thing that can move is the middle, and that's our structure. And we have an obligation as managers, and especially as learning managers, to help the structure deal with the fact that it is delivering predictability to two extremes of stakeholders, but it needs to give its people predictability. And that predictability to me is all of us understanding why we do the things we do. It's always us feeling that we're a part of a winning team. And winning team basically means we have a strategy to win. And finally, it's all of us feeling that we're part of an organization that can grow and that I will grow with it. Because once we have that, we have the true dynamics of growth. And it is those dynamics of growth that create successful organizations, that end up creating successful economies, and that end up, to a great extent, allowing people to have more satisfying lives and to have more solid growth. And I think, to a great extent, this is the biggest challenge organizations have, because many have, for many years, felt that agility meant that they have to be faster and change more often. Well, that's not the case. For the business to be faster, for the business to change more often, people within the business need to know that they're united by certain things that will not change. And it is those things that allow them to take bigger and more and better risks and deliver better results. That's all from me. So I am very much open to questions now, should there be any.
Thank you, Professor Habib, for this inspiring presentation. Dear participants, your questions are now welcome in the question box of the dashboard. I'm glad to share that we had a lot of attendees so far, full capacity for the webinar. We have people from all over the world, 5 continents, over 50 different countries. And they represent different levels of the organizations, like SEOs, HR decision makers, experts, which is the perfect illustration that a lot of people are passionate about learning and growth, which is great news, right? Okay, the first question is, tell us 3 things that the new generation of decision makers should adopt in early age.
In early age, I think
yes.
there's an interesting notion that the new people are different than the old people, which is why we took the new people, we put them in a box and we called them millennials, and we pretended they were special. But I think from an early age, what I have seen to be the key to successful leaders and managers is, first of all, to have a clear notion of purpose. And within this purpose, there's this concept of right and wrong. You know what the right decisions are. And you know that from a moral compass, there are right decisions and wrong decisions. And I think many times in the old management model, we sacrificed right and wrong for short-term gains, and we ended up paying the price much later. And I think this is something that maybe would give us gains for 4 or 5 years in the past, but today with an accelerating word, the first thing is to be very, very clear about your right and wrongs and stick to them, because that is what is key to many people who will be following you. I think the second thing is do the work. It drives me crazy when people want to challenge rules within their organizations because they don't agree with them, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, my basic instinct is, if you want the respect of your colleagues, deliver on the rules before you challenge them. So do the work. Be disciplined in the way you approach them, and do the work, because that gives you a right to speak. And I think many of the younger generation need to understand this, because that is how you build the resilience to drive you into leadership. And I think the third thing is build your net network. And when I talk about building your network, many times I think most of us understand the need to have a personal network from a career perspective. I think build a network of people that can make you think outside the box and think differently. So build yourself a network of people who can add information to you, that can stoke your curiosity, that can make you think about different things. So I love management, but I love hanging out with people who talk about biology, because biology tells me about what organisms are resilient, and that inspires me to keep thinking about management. And so I think really those are the three things. And if you want to wrap them into one thing, I'd say be very disciplined about what you want in your leaders, and then do it yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question is, what would you suggest as a critical path to culture change towards a more agile culture?
I think probably the most important one is a shift in leadership behaviors, and it's probably the hardest one to do. And so for me, really to force leadership to have many more conversations. What's really interesting is that many leaders feel that having conversations with their teams are something they have to do after work. Well, to a great extent, the big shift we're seeing right now is a lot of people just want to have a clear idea of what the plan is, what my role is in this plan, and how can I do more. And so we need to keep educating our leaders to have meaningful conversations with people around these issues, because leaders who do this tend to shift culture much quicker. Don't try to do 60 different things. Shifting culture really is more about 2 or 3 very visible changes in behavior, and typically they work better if we change behavior from the top.
Thank you. Another question related to organizations and changing them is, what are the approaches to drive learning from the outside in versus top-down or bottom-up?
Well, I think to a great extent, we still have a lot of work to do inside out. You know, I can teach a strategy class to 20 people in an organization, and what's missing usually is then having the strategy team come in and do the strategy presentation, have a critical review of what's being done internally. I think this is still something we're not very good at. And so we tend to send people out to learn about strategy and then send them back home. And then when they have critical voices about the organizational strategy, we tell them, we'll figure that one out later. So I think though it is interesting to go outside in, I think we have so much richness inside that needs to be worked on. And I think this is where our untapped potential sits, is how do we unlock all this thinking that could be going on inside. And though I am all in favor of bringing outsiders in to shock us once in a while, the reality is I think most of the potential is within.
Okay, thanks. And the next question here is, what are the high-level approaches to quantify agility of an organization, both as a state or as a process of transformation?
Mm-hmm. Quantification is always a tough one, but if we think about it in speed of decision making, and if we measure which decisions are taken at what level of hierarchy in the beginning of a period and end of the period, I think the more we push down, the more agile we become. And so to a great extent, one of the things that I like to track is how much information is being made available to people at each level of the hierarchy. And over time, what happens when we make more information available together with a change in leadership. And what we tend to see is that as decisions get made further and further down the stream, we get much quicker responses to changes, and we get much better results.
Thanks. Another question about leadership. The world leader is overrated in many reasons. In your perspective, what is the top 3 natural behaviors from a leader?
I think there's 2 for me, which 3. Okay, 3. Let's do 3. First of all, I think a leader has to be ambitious. Okay, and then has to have the second, which is this paradox of leadership. They have to be humble. So kind of we have to have this humble, ambitious is the first balance that's so difficult to achieve. Why? Because it is the one trait that I think most of us respect in our leaders. An ambition to allow us all to grow, but a humility to involve others in the decision-making process, and therefore making it feel part of the leadership process. And then the third one to me, and probably the most important one, is very clear ethical and moral boundaries to be the guardian of those boundaries within the organization. It is those leaders who bring results consistently in the long run, as opposed to leaders who keep shifting their moral boundaries. They might get results in the short run, but over the medium term, they tend to destroy organizations on the inside because those organizations lose their purpose and identity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Another question comes from a student, I think. In a world increasingly integrated, such as in Europe, and namely in banking and finance, how do you see the Agile world and decision-making process at the local and the regional level, and the role of the supervisors?
I think it's the same problem. You know, many times, if we can make quicker decisions within the same country, we will then be able to make decisions across countries at different offices, etc. It's just a simple question of defining very clearly what things are unchangeable. What are the things we all agree in all our structure, in every country, in every office, that we will never change? And it could be hiring practices, it could be our ethical code of conduct, it could be strategic clarity, it could be our process, whatever. There are certain things that we will never change. And those rules apply to all of us. And then it's also defining where can you have flexibility within that framework. And that is a governance discussion that needs to be had continuously with people. Because once people understand that this is how we all operate, and I think the caveat here is it has to apply to everybody. We cannot have senior managers who are exempt from this rule. Everybody has to live by these rules. What you'll tend to find is that you get much more agility in the structure because some things never change. It's when everything changes at the same time that we feel a sense of loss of control, and we tend to try to hold it down.
I understand that there are participants who can't ask their questions directly in the questions box. I would like to invite them to ask their questions over the email that is provided in the webinar communication in advance, and we will provide the replies in writing additionally. But still, we have a lot of other questions coming in the webinar question box. And one of them is from Central America. I work for the largest retail company in Central America. What's your suggestion for a company acting in the third world to adopt best practices as a first world enterprise?
Yeah, I think the term is emerging these days, but think about it this way. To a great extent, what we do know is that consumer education, if you look at the educational level in whatever country you're working on, you'll start to see that the same trend is happening in emerging economies as has happened in more developed economies, and it's happening quicker. As new generations get more knowledge, they're expecting faster, better service, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think one of the biggest challenges you have is how do you continue to execute at high levels of quality, which requires very directive management, because many of your employees will be less qualified, while at the same time allowing customers to feel they have personalized service. I think this is the big challenge of retail we're seeing in emerging markets, is that we just don't, the traditional retail development scheme was, first of all, there'll be 20 years where all we have to deliver is clean shops and predictable supply at good prices. And then in developed markets, it's more about the experience and the added value, et cetera, et cetera. This cycle is moving much, much quicker. And the big challenge is, how do you give part of your organization the discipline to deliver cleanliness, stock management, delivery on time, quality, et cetera, and at the same time, how do you allow people in store or people who are customer facing to adjust and adapt? And that is really the biggest challenge. If you're working on two speeds and your recruitment processes and the way you talk about things are at two speeds. But I think most of us know this, that what we expect from retail is high predictability in 80% of the relationship we have with them, and then we expect the staff to give us that little surprise that makes a difference. And I think that's the same across the world. The challenge in developing economies is making sure that you've worked with your staff long enough and trained them well enough that you can deliver that.
Thanks. Another question that we have is very interesting. It's how do leaders explain the first cause for do not value deep cooperation as much more important than competition?
Well, we have this concept of meritocracy, which we try to show around the world, which is basically we want to reward people who deserve more. And we feel that that works better through competition. We have instinctively found that. The problem that this creates is that we are competing, but nothing's uniting us. Okay, and so this is why I'm so insistent on purpose and strategy, because what it does is it gives us a framework that unites us. And within this framework, yes, we can compete against each other because competition is healthy and it's good for us. But we need that framework to make sure that our competition is constructive and not destructive. And we need to draw that line in the sand. And that's why I keep saying it's in the box, not outside the box. That box is what keeps us united. This is our identity. This is what makes us together. And we can compete in here. So I can have my kids compete against each other in football, but I will not let my kids reach the stage of competition where they destroy the family coherence.
Thanks. Now I'd like to combine two questions related to the future. One is, where do you see Agile methodology in the next 5 years? And the second one is, how is technology influencing leadership?
I think Agile methodology is great in terms of the front end of our business, the way we set up projects very quickly, the way we can fail quickly, the way we're incrementally, continuously building as we go along. And so I think this is a great toolkit to use when facing markets in rapid change. I think we forget that if I'm going to use Agile methodology in terms of my processes and the way I'm developing stuff, I need to make sure that my people have something more solid and more secure so they can feel comfortable being Agile. The problem really is we're trying to make everything Agile at the same time, and that creates chaos. And chaos is not healthy for anybody, because what it does is it tends to destroy value. So I think this is the first thing that we need to understand. And I think because of that, leadership function of united people around purpose, around strategy, around focus, and about growing people becomes so much more important. It was nice to have 20 years ago. It is mission critical today.
How can you show current leaders how fast the world is changing? We are talking different language inside the same organization.
Yes. Let me separate that out. I think we're talking different language because we're talking about different things. And I think this is the one thing that we have such a hard time understanding, is that yes, the world is changing very, very fast. I think everybody knows this. But I think what most leaders are telling the rest of their staff is that, yeah, the world is changing, but we can't keep changing because it will destroy a lot of our structure. And so I think we need to divide our world into the following. In the areas where I can predict the future, I will focus on building efficiency in processes. And in the areas where I cannot predict the future, I will allow people to make more decisions in an Agile structure. Now, how do I predict the future? Well, there's certain areas like supply chain where to a great extent I can predict my purchasing, et cetera, et cetera. But what new organizations are doing, and I think this is where the new and the old thinking meet, is they've understood they need to extend their supply chain all the way down to controlling what their customers are doing. When organizations have strong enough vision of product and brand that they actually lead their customers and tell their customers what to do, for example, they have a product that they know their customers will get up in the morning at 3 a.m. to get in a queue to buy, then what that gives us is the predictability that allows our leaders to build efficiency into our system. And that's where old and new have to meet. It's extend your supply chain to customer insights, which allows our whole supply chain to build efficiency in. And that's when you get that symbiosis that works so well in organizations, which is we have high predictability because we lead our customers.
Thank you. Thank you. Now a question regarding public organizations. How do you use this vision of management to public organizations that are full of rules and legal constraints imposed by the government?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to create rules. I think anybody who's managed anybody, let anybody can create a rule in 5 minutes. we have to be careful about rules. Rules are really good to get short-term results, but they have, in the medium and long term, they have secondary effects that are terrible. And so it would seem ridiculous that public entities are the ones that would have most rules, because rules allow me to control in the next week what's going to happen, but 3 weeks from now, individuals within my organization are going to start going around the rules, customers are going to go around the rules, et cetera, et cetera. What we need to understand is not that the world wants no rules. We need rules, but we need rules that have, for me, two conditions. One is they are rules that allow us to focus on what's really important. So, for example, if you have a fast food hamburger shop, then the rule that says how long you should grill the burger is a good rule because it allows you to focus on the customer instead of watching the burger. That's a good rule. It frees you to focus on what's important. The second condition, and I think the most difficult one, is whenever we put together a rule, we have to convince that this rule applies to everybody. If anybody is an exception to the rule, then the rule cannot exist. And this is really the toughest thing to do, because I think most of us complain about public organizations, not because they have rules, but they seem to have a bunch of rules that don't make sense, and they don't seem to apply to everybody. They don't free people, and they don't apply to everybody. And that gets us angry because we think that they have a false sense of organization, and that's cynical, and that's what gets us angry. So I think public entities have an obligation to review the rules regularly and ask those questions. And I think that one of the big challenges public entities have is they have not invested enough in management learning and management evolution and leadership development. And I think this is why they face such challenges.
Thanks. And another question touching on the generation differences. How do you see all this preoccupation with the millennials? And to add to this question, do you think that millennials add to the agility of companies?
I think millennials are probably the most educated group of people we have ever hired into our companies. But what millennials need to know is that the next ones will be even more, because it's been like this for the past 100 years. It will continue to be so. So, you know, there's this notion that millennials don't want, listen, millennials want the same as everybody else, okay? They want to feel that there's a plan to win. They want to feel they're part of the plan to win. They want to feel they're going to benefit from the plan to win, and they want to feel that they can grow and have great days at work as they do this. Actually, if you look at statistics about what millennials want, they want job security just as much as everybody else. They want to have long-term planning just as everybody else. They want to have predictability just like everybody else. So I think, you know, millennials were a great excuse for us to rethink the way we're doing the organization. But if we all look in the mirror, I think we're all millennials in that sense. The only difference is they're better qualified than we were at their age. But they need to understand that the next ones will be more qualified than them. And that is the cycle of life.
And our final question for tonight is, how do I measure and share the outcome of learning in an agile approach?
Interestingly enough, if you try to get a deeper understanding for how many people understand your purpose, you know what I find really interesting? You go into a company and you say, do you have values? And people say, yes, we have 5 values. And I say, can you tell me what they are? And in most companies, they can tell me 2 or 3, which tells you the level of work we have to do to build culture. We have a learning function, not to teach people how to use Excel or how to build a better spreadsheet. We have a learning function to allow people to learn how to succeed within our organization. And for that is people who understand our purpose so much that they can live it. It's tracking how people live within our purpose, how they live within our values. For example, tracking how much they understand our strategy. That is what it's about. We need to measure long-term outcomes because we are doing long-term work.
Thank you. Thank you. If there are questions that you couldn't send over the questions box or did not have an answer to a question, please feel free to email them to us. And also, I would like to address our audience tonight that we will continue this discussion during the Merit Summit in Lisbon in January 2018. and you're all welcome to join the Merit Summit and interact face-to-face with HR decision makers and business school representatives, professors who are passionate about corporate learning and development. And during the Merit Summit, you can all learn from the experience of big companies such as Nestle, Danone, KPMG, Virgin Media, LinkedIn, and many others, and bring the experience of your own companies as well. So thank you very much for your participation tonight. As you know, all the participants will have free access to the latest merit survey on the milestones for learning organizations. They will get an additional discount on the conference pass, plus a VIP gala dinner invitation for the Merit Summit as well. Keep in touch. We will be glad to continue this discussion further. Thank you very much, Professor Habib, for your inspiring inspiration and for the answers to all these specific questions. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.
Thank you.